Well, welcome everybody to Sciencing in Place. I'm really excited about tonight. Uh, Dr. Cynthia Wagner Weick is generously jumped on to speak with us tonight, and after a lot of crash courses in my understanding of art and understandings of Zoom, we're really excited about where tonight's presentation is going. What really excites me about tonight is the idea that while we've been sheltering in place, I know a lot of us have been going on walks and enjoying our local areas and paying attention to our local areas a little bit more than we might have used to when we were busily running from place to place. And so what I'm really excited to look at tonight is Dr. Weick's view of kind of how our natural environment where we live has inspired a lot of artists and hopefully inspires us too. So I'd love to introduce her. Dr. Cynthia Wagner Weick is a professor emeritus at the University of the Pacific. She taught there for 27 years in both their business and engineering schools, and has authored more than 30 articles and books. Somehow she's navigated this right and left brain thing, and also has a deep interest in art and art history. Currently, she works as a Point Lobos docent and offers public walks focused on the artists that painted at the reserve. And she has recently co-authored a book entitled Preserving Nature, a Field Guide to the Art and Artists of Monterey Bay with Carmel artist Joaquin Turner. So we're super excited to have her here tonight, and I'm gonna turn it over to her. Cynthia, thank you so much, and go ahead and start sharing your screen whenever you want.
Okay, terrific. Okay. All right, let me test out my, okay, here we go. So thank you, Juan. And by the way, I was going to tell you, call me Cynthia. You don't have to do the Dr. Cynthia White. But I want to thank Juan, and I also want to thank all of you for letting me join you to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is artists who painted in the Monterey Bay area in the late 19th century through the mid-20th centuries. And I enjoy talking about these artists not only out of nostalgia, but because they celebrate our region's natural beauty, which to this day still inspires artists, as Juan mentioned. So the theme of my talk tonight is that art and nature go hand in hand. And that if we're intentional about it, this will continue on into the future. So my guess is most of you are probably aware of our region's unique and enviable artistic past. Many, many artists passed through our area, and they came from all over the world. They came from Europe, Asia, Latin America, Australia. Within the US, they traveled from the East Coast to here. They came from the Midwest. Within California, they came from Northern California, mostly San Francisco. In addition, Southern California, mostly Laguna and Los Angeles. Some painted here and then they moved on, while others stayed. Some did not stand the test of time, but many have stood the test of time. And indeed, they're still collected today, and they can be seen at museums and galleries throughout the state and in some cases, the nation. We're only going to have time this evening to talk about 4 of them, but I hope at least it'll give you a small introduction. And I want to start out with Xavier Martinez. So this work was inspired from a view from what is now Highway 1 near Marina around Fort Ord Dunes State Park. I took a photograph several weeks ago that is actually a little south of the state park, but I was driving near dusk and I saw this scene and I had to stop the car and get out and take the photograph because I said, my God, that looks like the sky that Xavier Martinez probably saw 100 years ago. And I had to capture it. And indeed, I think it is very, very aligned. Now, Martinez's approach is normally thought of being a tonalist And what tonalism means is that you're using a limited color palette, number one, and number two, you're tending to focus on shapes. And therefore, tonalist paintings tend to have a flatness to them. Now, I think it's fair to say that Martinez is also influenced by Impressionism, which he was, because you can see his brushstroke. That's this kind of quick brushstroke. And so you can imagine he had impressionistic influence as well. But again, he's also known as being mainly a tonalist. It's really no surprise because Martinez studied under Arthur Matthews, who was one of the beginning tonalists at the Mark Hopkins Institute in San Francisco. And also Martinez studied under James McNeill Whistler because he took several trips to Europe. I love this piece. It's a small piece. I call it small but mighty, but it is very similar to quite a few of his paintings where he captures these huge swaths of the sky. So a little bit about his history. He was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, and he came to San Francisco thanks to the Mexican consul general and his wife, who, having seen his talent, sponsored his education at the Hopkins Institute as well as in Europe. I mean, they essentially adopted him when he was about 18 and brought him to the United States. Martinez had broad interests, and he was also very gregarious. His father in Mexico had run a bookshop. So chances are he was exposed to a lot of different ideas and ways of thinking. But again, he was also extremely gregarious. And on the right of the slide, you'll see Martinez sitting with a group of people in Copa's restaurant in San Francisco. Copa's was considered a hangout for a lot of bohemian artists in the early 1900s before the earthquake in 1906. And what you'll notice is that Martinez is on the right, and then next to him is Gottardo Piazzoni. And for those of you who know about art in this area, Piazzoni was another really well-known artist. Next to Piazzoni then is Maynard Dixon, and Maynard Dixon is an artist with whom Martinez traveled a lot, particularly to Arizona and Mexico to paint. Next to him is the poet George Sterling. And next to him is the writer Mary Austin, and then next to her is the writer Ambrose Bierce. And I haven't figured out who the woman on the far left of the photograph is, but surely this was a very interesting company, and this is kind of what Martinez was known for. He was able to bring these groups together. I've also shown you on the left a self-portrait that you can see at the Oakland Museum of Art, and then in the middle is a photograph by a very well-known photographer, Arnold Gent. So Martinez ended up spending most of his time in the Bay Area. He was one of the first professors at the California School of Arts and Crafts. That school still exists. It's now called the California College of the Arts. And he taught there for 30 years. But for a 5-year period, he came to be a professor at the Hotel Del Monte. And some of you may know that there was a very well-known gallery that started at the Hotel Del Monte after the earthquake. So he came down and taught there, and once again was known for gathering a lot of people around him, some of whom were the same people he hung out with at Copa's. He was a very popular professor at the California School of Arts and Crafts. Why? Because he encouraged his students to experiment. In his own work, frankly, he looks pretty much the same throughout his career. Again, very tonalist with some impressionistic influences, but he had seen so many different kinds of artists in Europe and also in Mexico, where he met the likes of Diego Rivera. And so he wanted his students to experiment, and they all very much appreciated that. So despite living in this area for only a few years, Martinez is buried in the San Carlos Cemetery in Monterey. And I had once read that his headstone is decorated with the same X that he signed his paintings with. So of course I had to go check it out. And a couple of months ago, I went over to the San Carlos Cemetery, and it took me a while, but sure enough, here is Xavier Martinez in the cemetery in his headstone, and there is his famous X with which he signed his paintings. I mentioned that you can see his work in the Oakland Museum of Art. You can also see his work at the Crocker Museum. Otherwise, he's in a lot of private collections. So I promised Juan that I would leave some time after each artist for questions. So if you have questions, pose them. If you have comments, if you know something I don't know, please contribute it, because I'd like to hear your thoughts. So do we have any questions yet, Juan?
And thank you, Cynthia, for pointing that out. I was so excited to get to your piece. I forgot to mention that
no worries.
If you have questions, to please ask them throughout. If you put them into the chat or if you put them into the Q&A section, I'll be happy to relay those so that they get answered.
Yeah, excellent. And again, if you have comments too, because I'm always interested in learning more and more about all of these artists. So with that, if we don't have any questions, we will turn to another really well-known artist, and that is William Ritchell. This painting is called Monterey in the Moonlight, and it shows how talented Ritchell was in capturing the drama of the coast, and really that's what he is most known for. He also painted scenes of horses, and he'll have fishermen on boats, but he clearly favored the open ocean. This piece was painted roughly across from Fanshell Beach, the Fanshell Beach overlook in Pebble Beach. And I have some photographs here on the right that Joaquin Turner took that he thinks are probably roughly where William Ritchell stood. So let me tell you a little bit about Ritchell. He was born and educated in Germany. He loved the water, and he became a sailor for several years before entering the Royal Academy of Art in Munich. While he was on the boat sailing, by the way, people did recognize he was a very talented artist. So he went and got some formal training. At the Royal Academy, he was exposed, and the Royal Academy, by the way, is down to your bottom left. He was exposed to German Impressionism. And I like to stay away, frankly, from generalizing about artistic styles, but German Impressionists do tend to have a very strong brushstroke and also a lot bolder coloring than, let's say, a typical French Impressionist. And again, I don't like to generalize, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Ritchell continued traveling across Europe after he graduated, and he became very well known. And he garnered a lot of attention and a lot of awards as an artist there. In 1895 then, when he was about 30, he traveled to the United States. And in 1904, he became an American citizen. He continued to visit New York, but by that time, visit Europe, but by that time, New York became his major exhibition venue all the way through the 1930s. And frankly, at this time in the United States, New York was where you wanted to exhibit. It was the place to be. So, you know, he was in the right place to become a very well-known artist. And while he was there in New York, he earned the National Academician Award of the National Academy of Design. And that's the building to your right in the photograph. And that is really the honor that you can get as an artist in the United States. So by the time he comes to California to live permanently, he's already in his 50s and he's already really famous. He comes and he builds a castle-like stone studio home in the Carmel Highlands, which, by the way, still stands. And if you're in Point Lobos and you're near Bird Island and you look up, you can see it. It's actually to the west of Highway 1, and it's just a beautiful castle-like stone building on a coastal bluff. And it gave gave him an unobstructed perch on the ocean that he absolutely cherished. And let me show you another painting that he might have conceived while he was looking out over the ocean. When you think of William Ritchell, this frankly is more of the kind of painting you're going to think of. This is 50 inches by 60 inches. It's a very large painting. When you see paintings like this by Ritchell, and I've been able to see quite a few of them, you literally feel like you're going to fall into the water. I mean, it's got so much motion. He's got so much proclivity at expressing the light. They are just absolutely stunning paintings. So while he lived in Carmel, he continued traveling throughout the world. He particularly liked the South Sea islands like Tahiti. And upon returning from his various journeys, I've read that he could be seen in the Monterey Hills painting at an easel dressed in a sarong. So I'm imagining this gentleman in his 50s, 60s, eventually 70s and 80s, you know, wrapped in a sarong painting. I think he was my kind of guy, interesting man. And indeed, he ended up dying in his home in the Carmel Highlands in 1949 at the age of 85. And again, very, very well known. He was also a generous person, and I like to mention this because he joined other prominent artists in this area, including Armin Hansen at the time, to raise money to build a permanent location for the Carmel Art Association. And as you know, this still operates in Carmel. During World War II, Ritchell had his gold medals that he had earned as an artist melted down, and he donated the proceeds to the American Red Cross. He was also very generous in his help of other artists, you know, who he admired. And one of those artists is someone we're going to be discussing next, and that is E. Charlton Fortune. But before we get to E. Charlton Fortune, do I have any questions yet, Juan, or comments?
I always forget to unmute myself. No questions, but just another reminder, definitely comments and questions are welcome.
Okay, please contribute. Again, even your comments. Okay, I'm going to move on to E. Charlton Fortune. So this is a piece, believe it or not, of the Carmel Mission. And to see it from the vantage point that she used, you have to go to the Portola Crespi Cross, which you can access from either Carmel Meadows or from the Carmel River Beach. Now, I don't recommend doing this right now because, again, we're still sort of in a shelter-in-place situation. But once we're out of that, I highly recommend going to see, particularly this place, any of the places that we're seeing that the artists painted from, because it is very, I was very excited to walk about 200 feet down from this cross and look over, and indeed, to see this, where she stood, to do this painting. And on the left is a photograph I've taken of the area now. And again, you can see the mission, but I want to show you something I think is even more interesting. And that is a photo that was actually taken about the time she would have painted this. And again, you know, you can see how much the area has developed and much more of what she would have seen. Now, one thing that's really important to know about E. Charlton Fortune is she hardly ever painted exactly what she saw. She said, "Why would I do that? That would be like taking a photograph, and I don't want to be a photographer." So when you see an E. Charlton Fortune painting, you're often going to see something in the painting that is not there. So check that out next time you see one of her works. You can see her works in different places in the country, but particularly at the Crocker, Oakland, and also at the Monterey Museum of Art. But you'll typically see something that's not there, and that's exactly the way she wanted it. She would first stand and make a sketch of a small piece, and then she would take it back to her studio. And at this time, when she painted this painting, she had studios in both our area and also in San Francisco, and then she would paint the much larger work. She is known as an impressionist. but she was a very unique impressionist. She was known in particular for a very strong brushwork and also very bold color. She had a very unique style. She was called an original, which she loved. Just being an original as a person and also an artist. She did not like to be pigeonholed, and her work is indeed very distinctive. I hope some of you in the audience got the chance to see the retrospective of hers at the Monterey Museum of Art, because it was over 100 pieces and it was just stunning, stunning work. So a little more about her. She was born in Sausalito and eventually studied at the Mark Hopkins Institute in San Francisco, because that's where you went to study if you were a Californian. But then once the earthquake hit, she went to the Art Students League of New York. So she got some exposure on the East Coast, and then she went to Europe. And indeed, she spent a lot of time in Europe. At this time, in the artistic world, the gold standard for education was a European education. And then I mentioned again, New York was also important, but Europe was really the where you wanted to go if you really wanted to learn to be a great artist. And she had a lot of experience there. I have a photo of her for you here when she is about 30 years old. And by that time, she is living more permanently in our area. And she's also continuing to travel throughout the world, mainly Europe. But again, she's making her home here. Again, also had some other studios, such as one in San Francisco and also Rhode Island. In her early 40s, so not long after she came to Monterey, she made a major change in her life. She decided to do exclusively liturgical art. So she turned away from doing these phenomenal landscapes that she was doing all over the world and turned to work that celebrated the Catholic Church. Really shouldn't come as a great surprise, because she was born and bred Catholic and she was a very devout Catholic. And so this is just something she decided to do. So she started a guild. And that guild of many people was responsible for doing a lot of the work for cathedrals and Catholic churches, mainly in the United States. She became extremely well known for this, but many people have decried that she got away from her landscapes because they were so beautiful. It has made her landscape work, however, all the more valuable for those people who own it. Because there's just not a lot of it out there. She eventually passed away, by the way, at the Carmel Manor in 1969. She did sign her paintings E. Charlton Fortune. A couple reasons. Number one, she hated her first name. Her first name was Euphemia. She had people call her Effie, but she didn't even want to put that in her paintings. So you'll see her paintings are signed E. Charlton Fortune. But there's really another reason, and we're pretty sure that she did this intentionally to give the impression she was a male artist in her early artistic days. Why? Because women were simply not taken seriously as artists. And indeed it worked, because in her early days, people didn't know that E. Charlton Fortune was a female painter. And by the time they found out, she had already gained a lot of recognition and had earned awards. And really all she wanted was a level playing field. She just wanted to be, treated as all the other artists were. And indeed, she did gain success in her own time, but one accolade eluded her, and that was the National Academician Award that I mentioned that William Ritchell got. And indeed, I mentioned that Ritchell liked to help artists. He and a couple of other artists who were academicians and admired E. Charlton Fortune recommended her, nominated her to be an academician, but they were unsuccessful, unfortunately. And she kind of never let go of that, even though she gained a lot of fame in her own life. But she had two strikes against her. She was female, but she was also from California. And I mentioned at this time in America, New York was the place to be an artist, and only 10% of the academicians at that time were from California. So it's not terribly surprising that she was not accepted into that august group. Okay, we're going to turn to our fourth artist, Franz B Shaw, and I'm hoping there's maybe comments or questions.
We do have actually several comments and questions.
Okay.
We have to go back to Ritual first. We got a
That's
couple
great.
of grade questions.
He's one of my favorites.
One of the easiest, or one of the simplest, or easiest to answer is, was Ritual buried here? Can we do a cemetery tour of all these artists?
Oh my gosh, I knew somebody was going to ask me that, and I am trying to find that myself. I have not found Ritual and I have not found Fortune, but I promise you when I do, I will let Juan know and have him communicate with you, because I think it'd be wonderful to do a cemetery tour. I just haven't been able to find those yet, but I will keep looking.
Another question was, in speaking to Ritual's philanthropy, somebody asked if Ritual donated the pieces of his to the Monterey Museum of Art.
His family trust did. And thank you for mentioning that, because there is a permanent exhibition when the museum reopens of Ritual's work there. And it's not to be missed. It's really good. But it's the family trust that donated that. But
Okay.
You can see Ritual's work also at the De Young, at the Crocker. He's quite well distributed, and on the East Coast too.
All right, now we're going to go to Charlton Fortune, or
Okay.
Effie. Did she contribute any of the Carmel Mission artwork? Was any of her work there?
To my knowledge, no. You mean in the gallery within the Carmel Mission?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
99% sure that no. A lot of her work, again, I think the Monterey Museum of Art still claims to have the largest number of her paintings that are not in private collections or at the Crocker or at the Oakland Museum.
Okay. And somebody's asking about Charlton. Is that one of her family names? Or was that a very interesting middle name?
Ooh, that's a great question. And you know what? I won't do it tonight, but I'm going to refer the person who asked that question to Scott Shields' book, Artists at Continent's End. And then he also has written a book specifically about E. Charlton Fortune that went along with that retrospective that I mentioned. And I'm sure that is answered somewhere in there. To my knowledge, it's not a family name, but it's possible. So I won't try to answer that. These are tough ones.
We've got a great crowd.
Yeah.
So I think you're now up to date. So I think you're ready to go on.
Okay, great. And again, I'll get the answer to the Charlton question and send it to Juan as well, because I have both those books. Matter of fact, I'm surrounded by them right now. Okay, so the fourth and last artist we're going to talk about this evening is Franz B Shaw, and he's the perfect one to end with, because when you look at this painting, I hope everyone thinks color. And I hope everybody thinks, my gosh, I've never seen Headland Cove look like that. Because as a docent, I have walked by Headland Cove many, many times, and I've never seen it quite this beautiful, even though it's always gorgeous, but not quite this beautiful and not quite this colorful. And here I've taken a photograph for you on kind of a cloudy day, which gives a decent contrast for you. I wasn't able, by the way, to show you more closely where he stood, because I would have had to go outside the boundaries that I'm allowed to go outside as a docent. But this is Headlands Cove, and this work is verging on expressionism. And expressionism is, in a nutshell, is an artist expressing not only what he or she sees, but also what they're feeling. And so what he is feeling right now is a lot of color. And let me tell you more about him so you might understand why he enjoyed color so much. So he was born in Austria, and he began as a ceramic painter. And even while he was still in Austria up until his teens, He studied ceramic painting and became very good at it. So by the time he came to the United States, roughly when he was 20 with his family, he was very adept at this, and he became very well known as a porcelain painter. And some of you may have seen his very famous plates and very famous vases. These are all over. I've seen these at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I've seen some in galleries in Carmel. I've seen them in the Crocker, etc. He became known as King of the Roses because of these porcelain pieces. And he had studios all over the East Coast. He had one in Pennsylvania, he had one in Michigan, he had one in Ohio, and he also lived in New York City. But in roughly 1900, he made a fateful trip with his family to California. And like so many people who come to California, he said, oh my gosh, I've got to move here. So a couple years later, he and his family moved to Pasadena, and he opened a home studio there. He kept on with his porcelain painting, but not for long, because he decided to make a trip to Europe, and he stayed there for a couple of years. He went to several different countries, including France, where he was exposed to Impressionism. And when he came back, he was a very different kind of painter. He continued painting flowers, and in the beginning, he did a series of the missions in Southern California. So this happens to be San Juan Capistrano mission, which would have been kind of near his home. And this would have been also about the time that he was one of the first painters in the California Art Club, and this had the likes of William Wendt and many other really well-known Southern Californian Impressionist painters. But then he moved away from buildings even, and he really started going more strictly to landscapes. He started going up the California coast, and when he got to Monterey, obviously he painted the painting of Point Lobos I showed you, but he's got several that he's done of the Monterey area, and each is just more beautiful than the next. They're really, really nice. Towards the end of his life, and he died in about 1929, he made a trip to Zion National Park in Utah. And I always call this Franz B Shaw on fire, because this is Expressionism. For those of you who've been to Zion Park, you know, it's very colorful at times depending upon the, the sun, but it doesn't look like this. So this is Franz B Shaw seeing what he sees, painting what he sees, but also painting what he feels. And indeed, does a beautiful job at it. Now, I mentioned that he's a good person to kind of end our talk of the artists with, and that is because in the 1930s and 1940s, art starts to change. And frankly, the artists that we've been talking about lose favor. And other artists who are in different approaches become much more popular. So the abstract artists, the conceptual artists, the process artists, the social realists. And we move away from landscapes that capture the beauty of a region like ours until the 1960s and 70s. And then it roars back. And if you were lucky enough to have kept one of these pieces, or your grandmother kept one of these pieces, or they were in the attic, or you had gone to a garage sale even and found one of these paintings, you truly ended up having a treasure. Because as I mentioned before, quite a few of these people, and definitely the four that I've shown you here, are still widely collected, and you can see them in many museums across the state, and in some cases the nation. So they've regained their popularity. And I honestly don't think this art will ever go out of style. And I think there's a reason that we still have a lot of current artists, and I think some of you in the crowd probably are artists, maybe professional, maybe amateurs, because our landscape is so inspiring. And there's something about the beauty of our landscape and the beauty of the way these artists capture it that I personally think will always remain. And we are deeply fortunate to live here. But we shouldn't take that for granted. And now I want to turn to a little different but related topic, and that is the need for intentionality in preserving nature and art in the future. Because other areas in California have not been as fortunate and as intentional as we have been. So I don't have time to go through this data, completely, but I want to focus on a couple things. What I've done for you is I have the population by county of several counties that are known for their art communities historically in the state of California. I've got the population in 1900, the population in 2014, because that's the latest I could find. I've got the area in square miles, and then the density. And just for purposes of this evening, I want you to look at Orange County, which is where Laguna is. And Laguna, like Monterey, is still an art colony, and a very well-known one. But look at the population in 1900 and look how close it is to Monterey counties. Look at the red versus the green. Then look at the population in 2014. 3 million in Orange County, 416,364 in Monterey County. Our land area is a lot larger than Orange County. And so when you get to the population density, you have 3,816 people per square mile in Orange County. And you have 123 in Monterey County. And I mean, there's no question why so many of us live here. I hesitate sometimes to even show this slide because I'm afraid that people are going to realize, what they're missing. I mean, we just are so fortunate here. Let me show you how else we're fortunate. And that is that our county has always made environmental protection and preservation a priority. I found some numbers that represent the land use in our county. And you'll notice that almost 25% is in public and quasi-public land, in parks, military facilities, recreational and community facilities. And only 5% of it is developed in residential, commercial, and industrial use. And of course, a lot of it is agricultural land. And then to the right, I want you to notice that we have over 50 national, state, county, and regional parks in our county alone. And in addition, another 16 marine reserves and several prominent not-for-profit conservation organizations on top of that. So I think it's fair to say that in conclusion this evening, there are very few areas in the world where the realms of nature and the realms of art are so intertwined, and where what is good for preserving nature is good for preserving art, and vice versa. And I just really believe that we all need to do everything in our power to make sure we never, ever lose sight of this. So that's what I have for you this evening. Before I take more questions, and I hope comments, and by the way, I'm not forgetting your questions. So even the ones I don't know, I will find the answers to, and hopefully we'll be able to get those to you. But I do have some quick acknowledgements to make. Juan mentioned Joaquin Turner earlier. He and I have published a handbook recently, and he was a wonderful collaborator on that. And some of the material I used tonight was out of that book, so I want him acknowledged. Also, this evening, I used high-res images from Josh Hardy Gallery and the Saginaw Museum of Art in Michigan and Trotter Galleries. And then I also like to mention the Point Lobos Docent Organization. I had a long interest in art and art history, thanks to my mother, really. And I've had a long interest in nature. But it's only been the last couple of years that I've had the time to bring these two realms together. And the Point Lobos Docent Organization has done so much to encourage me to do that. So I want to thank them as well. And now, more questions and comments, please.
And we definitely got a couple.
Okay.
One, just going back to that Point Lobos organization,
Yeah.
You're getting some docent related questions. So in your
Okay.
perspective, as someone who spends a lot of time there, is there an artist that you think best captures the beauty of Point Lobos itself?
Who? Oh, I'll tell you what. I do a walk now, a public walk. Well, when the reserve is open, and I could have chosen from any number of artists to include in that walk. I mean, I probably found 50 or 60 different artists who have painted Point Lobos, and that's in the past. That's from 1900, to 1950. So I don't know if the question is current or early artist, but I'll tell you the ones I ended up choosing. If I can remember all 10 of them now. Pedro de Lemos. Charlton Fortune has a beautiful painting of Cypress Cove. Child Hassam, the Impressionist, who's from New York, has some beautiful work there. Franz B Shaw, obviously. Ritchell has some beautiful work of Point Lobos. Armin Hansen has a couple of Point Lobos paintings that are great. Let's see if I'm missing anyone. Oh, Mary Danielle Morgan. Oh, I would be very remiss to not mention her. She loved cypress trees, and she came to Point Lobos frequently to paint cypress trees 4 days before she passed away after a good long life. She was in her late 80s. She was at Point Lobos painting a cypress tree, and that painting was on her easel in her studio the day she died. So Mary Danielle Morgan is another one. And then I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Edward Weston. Now, obviously, he's not a painter, he's a photographer, but he loved Point Lobos so much that his ashes are there, and the beach is named after him, Weston Beach. And of course, his family still lives in the Carmel Highlands, and a lot of them are photographers. He's done phenomenal work on Point Lobos. So I hope I gave you enough there to consider. I mean, I don't think there's any one. In terms of frequency, it would be Mary Danielle Morgan. But again, there's so many artists who captured Point Lobos, and I'm sure you've all been out there. You can see why. I mean, in this 350-acre area has so many different microclimates. I mean, I never get tired of being out there. That was a long-winded answer.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you brought up your walk. We have a comment that just said that they've been on your walk and it was tremendous.
Oh, nice! Thank you.
You have an endorsement. The flip side is the other question, or the question which I share is when do you have those walks? How do we go on an artist-themed walk there?
Okay, so as I think everybody knows, unfortunately, the reserve has been closed. It's going to be reopened, I think, in mid-May, but we don't know when docent activity will start again. But I can tell you that the public walks are always announced on the Point Lobos website, and I think also on the PLF website. And that walk is simply named Artists of Point Lobos. And I do it once a month at least. Sometimes I do it a couple times a month because somebody will call me and say they want to bring a group, and if I know them, I'm happy to do it. I always do it as a public docent, as a volunteer, and I make that also a public walk. But I love doing it, and thank you for whoever's out there who went on it. I'll tell you one thing I love about doing it is so many people on that walk know about these artists, and so it really becomes a learning community. I mean, we really learn from each other, so it's not just me talking at other people.
Okay, another question. Going back to the artists, you referenced an interaction between Rachel and Charlton Fortune. Did any of these people hang out together? Did they all hang out together? Were they quarantine buddies or what?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel is quite a bit older than Charlton Fortune, and he's older than Armin Hansen. I mean, I know that they certainly met and convened. And by that, I mean, they would be in different venues with one another, because a lot of these artists were Karma Art Association artists. And so that's one way that they all met. In the early 1900s, when the earthquake happened, and so many of the artists started coming down here, they started showing at the Hotel Del Monte. And so they would meet each other, you know, as they were showing at the Hotel Del Monte. But also keep in mind that these artists traveled a lot. So I mentioned Charlton Fortune was on the road a lot. And so my guess is she didn't, you know, hang out a lot, you know, with people. Again, I can't answer that. I wasn't there, but I do know that she was on the road a lot. But there were a lot of venues where these artists could have met. So, for instance, the Forest Theater. Several of these artists would make the backdrops of the Forest Theater sets. And that would be another way that they would all meet. Mary Danielle Morgan in particular, we didn't talk about her tonight as an artist, you know, among the four, but she was very much an organizer. And she was an artist who really dedicated herself to this region. Once she got down here in the early 1900s, she really didn't leave. Even though her work traveled all over the country, she stayed here. So she was another person who would have galvanized these people. And apparently she loved visits to her studio. So again, I think the answer is yes, there was certainly interaction among these artists, but probably some more than others.
We have another comment, and we might finish with this comment, but just another thank you to you. Somebody really appreciated the juxtaposition of the photos and the paintings.
Oh, well, good. Thank you.
How nice it is to see those things.
Yeah.
It is the present day. I want to thank you for your enthusiasm, for your depth, for the fact that you're going to research some questions.
Yes, definitely. The cemetery one may take me a while.
I'll tell them to brace themselves. And then I will be definitely looking for your hike, and I encourage everybody else to. It is on the PLF website, so you can find the Artists of Point Lobos walk there on the schedule. I'm looking forward to it. For those people that are looking forward to next week's Sciencing in Place, I just wanted to let everybody know that we'll be hosting Jared Alper. He's coming from the University of Washington via Zoom, and he'll be talking about his work kind of surveying all the mathematical modeling that we're doing around COVID-19. And so what are those models? How are they developed? Those sort of very interesting and topical things. And so I hope you'll join us again for that. Cynthia, thank you again.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.